Most people tell this story as a compliment, but a compliment from Dean Martin was never quite what it appeared to be. The story has been repeated in various forms by people who were in the Ed Sullivan building on a particular Sunday evening in 1965. Some of them remembered it word for word. Others remembered the shape of it, the tone, the deliberate pause before it landed, the quiet certainty with which it was delivered to whoever happened to be standing nearby. What they agreed on was this: Dean Martin had said the same thing to several different people over the course of that night, and every person who heard it walked away with a slightly different understanding of what he had meant. That was the particular quality of Dean Martin's observations about other performers. They were not unclear. They were not dismissive in the way that professional competition can make a man dismissive. And they were not generous in the way that professional courtesy can make a man generous. They occupied a different category entirely: honest, specific, and slightly difficult to interpret, in the way that a precise observation about something complicated tends to resist easy summary. By the time the evening ended, Dean's words had traveled from the wings of the Ed Sullivan stage, through the backstage corridors, into the production office, and out into the early New York night. Everyone who heard them agreed they were about Tom Jones. Not everyone agreed what they meant. The Ed Sullivan Show on Sunday nights was not simply a television program. It was, for most of the 1960s, the single most important stage in American popular entertainment, a gateway through which musicians, comedians, and performers of every description entered the awareness of a country that watched in the tens of millions. A Sullivan booking did not guarantee success in America, but the absence of one made success significantly harder to explain. By 1965, the British were arriving in waves. The Beatles had performed on the Sullivan stage in February of 1964, and what followed was a transformation of American popular music that the industry had not fully anticipated and was still trying to process. The Rolling Stones had come through, Herman's Hermits, the Dave Clark Five. The Sullivan stage had become the point of entry for a new era, and the Sullivan booking had become the thing that separated a British act with American ambitions from one that had actually arrived. In 1965, a record called "It's Not Unusual" went to #1 in the United Kingdom. It was written by Gordon Mills and Les Reed. It was performed by a 24-year-old singer from Pontypridd, Wales, named Tom Jones, a name the American public had not yet encountered, a voice they had not yet heard, a performer whose particular qualities they had no existing framework for evaluating. The Sullivan booking followed the chart position, as it tended to do. Tom Jones in 1965 was not the Tom Jones that American audiences would come to know over the following decade. He was not yet the Las Vegas institution, not the velvet-jacketed showman of the large rooms, not the figure who would spend the better part of 15 years as one of the defining acts of the Strip. He was 24 years old, performing in America for one of the first times, carrying the particular combination of confidence and concealed uncertainty that tends to define a performer in the moment before they discover whether the world outside their home country will receive what they are offering. His background did not map neatly onto the world he was entering. He had grown up in a Welsh mining town, the son of a coal miner, in a community that worked with its hands and expressed itself through music in a specific way: loud, unguarded, physical, direct. He had not been trained through the orchestrated pathway that the British entertainment industry of the 1950s tended to favor. He had simply sung since he was very young, with a voice that caused people to stop what they were doing to listen. And he had kept singing through small venues, local clubs, modest engagements, until the voice had found its record and the record had found its audience. What the Ed Sullivan stage represented in 1965 was not simply an opportunity. It was the first real test of whether what Tom Jones did, the specific quality of his performance, the physical directness of it, the commitment and volume of it, would translate to audiences who had grown up with very different ideas about what popular music was supposed to look and feel like. Tom had made a decision, sometime before he arrived, that the only way to do it was the way he had always done it. Completely. Without reservation. Giving the song everything it required and trusting that an audience was an audience, and that what worked in one room worked in another. Dean Martin in 1965 occupied a position in American entertainment that is difficult to fully describe without having been attentive to it at the time. He was not simply famous. He was not simply successful. He was the operating definition of a particular idea about what a performer could be. Cool in a way that has never been exactly replicated. Effortless in a way that was not actually effortless at all, but that required considerable discipline to make appear that way. His television variety show had just launched on NBC that September. His films continued to perform well. The Rat Pack years had given him a social capital that most performers in the industry could not match. He moved through the entertainment world with the ease of someone who had stopped needing to prove anything, which made him, paradoxically, one of the most attentive observers of performers who were still in the process of proving themselves. He had seen every kind of act. He had watched Frank Sinatra work a room in the 1940s. He had been on stage with Sammy Davis Jr. more times than he could count. He had stood in wings across America and watched performers of every description come and go. And he had developed, over the course of all of that, a fairly precise understanding of what separated a performer who could genuinely do the thing from one who could only do it under specific conditions, in a specific room, for a specific kind of audience. When he ended up in the wings of the Ed Sullivan stage that evening, and the accounts of how exactly he came to be there are slightly inconsistent, as accounts of unplanned backstage encounters from that era tend to be, he was not there for any particular reason. He was in the building. He had stopped to look. Those two facts were enough. The audience that Sunday night was already warm by the time Tom Jones was introduced. Sullivan ran a precisely calibrated program, and the order of acts mattered in ways that an experienced television audience could feel without quite understanding why. The act before Tom had gone well. The room was ready. And then Tom Jones walked to the center of the stage, and the band began the opening bars of "It's Not Unusual," and something in the room shifted. Dean Martin, watching from the wings, had time to register the shift before anything had technically happened, before Tom had sung a note, before the audience had done anything visible. He had been in enough rooms to recognize what it felt like when something was about to change the atmosphere of a place. A room changes before the performance does. It changes with the entrance, with the way a performer moves to the microphone, with the quality of the 3 or 4 seconds before the music takes over and the crowd decides whether to follow. He watched. He had no particular reason to stay. He had things to attend to, people nearby, the ordinary demands of an evening in a building full of television production. The song was not long. He could have listened to 30 seconds, formed his impression, and walked away. He did not walk away. He stayed through the opening verse, through the first chorus, through the moment in the bridge where Tom's voice did something that no recording technology in 1965 had fully managed to capture. Something that existed only in the live version, only in the room, only when the voice was doing what it did, when there was nothing between it and the listener. He stayed through the end. He watched the audience's reaction. He was still standing in the wings when the cameras cut away and Tom walked off stage. And then Dean Martin said what he said. What Dean had seen from the wings was not what the television cameras were capturing. It was the same event, but from a vantage point that revealed things the broadcast could not show. He saw the physicality of it at close range, the way Tom's entire body was engaged with every phrase, not as performance convention, not as learned stage movement, but as something that appeared to happen spontaneously, as if the voice required the movement in the way a fire requires oxygen. He saw the audience in the specific moment before they responded, the 2 or 3 seconds when the room had received something and had not yet decided what to do with it, and he saw them decide. The audience was not a Tom Jones audience. They had not spent years with this voice. They were encountering it cold, without preparation, without the accumulated warmth of familiarity. And they responded the way people respond when something exceeds what they were prepared for. Dean watched all of it, the way a craftsman watches another craftsman work at something they have both devoted their lives to thinking about. The first person Dean said it to was standing near him in the wings when Tom walked off. A crew member, or possibly a production assistant, accounts from that night differ in the specifics. He said it without particular emphasis. In the quiet, direct way he tended to say things he meant seriously. Someone else heard it in the corridor a few minutes later. A third person encountered the same sentence in the production office not long after. By the time the broadcast had finished, it had traveled through the building and established itself as the unofficial verdict of the evening. Not from the audience, not from the production team, but from Dean Martin, who had been standing in the wings and had seen something he felt the need to describe to whoever happened to be nearby. The words themselves were not complicated. They were not elaborate or analytical in the way of a formal assessment. They were the kind of precise observation that a careful observer offers when they have witnessed something that resists the usual categories. Not a compliment in the conventional sense, and not a prediction about commercial success, and not the kind of generous professional endorsement that performers exchange as a matter of industry habit. They were something closer to a description of a difficulty, the difficulty being that what Tom Jones had done on that stage was not something that fit into any existing framework Dean Martin had for talking about popular music in 1965. What he kept saying was not about the voice alone, and not about the performance alone, and not about the audience's reaction alone. It was about the combination of those things, the way the voice and the performance and the room had become, for the duration of the song, a single thing. Dean Martin, who had built his entire career on the art of maintaining cool distance between himself and whatever he was performing, had watched a man who maintained no distance at all, who gave everything to the song without any visible reservation, and who appeared to expect the song to give everything back. That was not how Dean worked. That was not how Sinatra worked. It was not how any of the performers Dean most respected worked. And yet it had worked, obviously, undeniably, in the room, in front of an audience that had not come to the Ed Sullivan Theater expecting to feel what Tom Jones had just caused them to feel. Dean Martin in 1965 was at the peak of a particular kind of mastery. He had spent decades learning how to make the difficult appear effortless. What he had just watched was someone who had made no attempt at that, who had made the difficult appear exactly as difficult as it was, and who had found, through that honesty, something that effortlessness could not quite reach. He was not sure what category to place it in. He was not sure the industry had a category for it yet. That was the part he kept repeating to whoever would listen. Not that Tom Jones was impressive, not that Tom Jones was going to be successful, though both of those things were apparent. What Dean kept saying was simply that Tom Jones was something he, Dean Martin, a man who had built a career on understanding show business with unusual precision, could not entirely explain. And Dean Martin, in 1965, could explain almost everything about show business. Almost everything. Most people have heard this story as evidence that Dean Martin admired Tom Jones. They are not wrong, but they are not quite right either. Because what Dean said that night was not quite admiration in the ordinary sense of the word. It was something closer to the reaction of a man who has encountered a thing that does not fit inside his existing understanding of the world, and who has decided, instead of forcing it to fit, to simply say so. The words traveled and were repeated, and eventually settled into the kind of story that circulates in the backstage memory of an era, imprecise in its details, consistent in its emotional logic. What remains is not Dean Martin's specific sentence. What remains is the image of him standing in the wings of a Sunday night variety program, watching a young Welsh singer perform a pop song, and finding himself unable to look away. And finding, when it was over, that the most honest thing he could do was say exactly that. The night ended. The building emptied. Tom Jones went on to become Tom Jones. Dean Martin went on to become, more fully and finally, the thing he had always been, the coolest man in a room, in any room, by the width of whatever gap he maintained between himself and everything he was doing. But for the duration of one song, in the wings of the Ed Sullivan Theater, on a Sunday evening in 1965, that gap had closed. Because something on that stage had made it close, and Dean Martin, to his credit, had been honest enough to say so.